So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to get started in just about a minute or so. I want to make sure that everyone has had the opportunity to join the Zoom before we officially begin. But in the meantime, feel free to put in the chat where you're tuning in from. We always like to hear where our audience is joining us from. I've also put some helpful links in the Zoom chat for you all, including information about where you can purchase the book and also information about closed captioning and some information about the museum as well. It looks like we have a bunch of people joining from the New York City area, so welcome. We have some people from Pennsylvania, Florida, all over this evening. So again, thank you for joining us. For those of you who are just joining, welcome. We'll get started in just a few moments. And feel free to take a look at the chat for some helpful links. It looks like most people have been able to join, so I'm going to go ahead and get things started. So good evening again, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's book talk for All-Consuming Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat as part of our History of Antisemitism series. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you all again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Now, today we are honored to be joined by John Efron and Michael Brenner. John Efron is the Court Professor of Jewish History at the University of California at Berkeley, where he specializes in the cultural and social history of German Jewry. A native of Melbourne, Australia, he has a BA from Monash University, an MA from New York University, and a PhD at Columbia University. In his work, Efron has focused on the way German Jewry attempted to reinterpret and reinvent Jewish culture in the wake of its complex encounter with modernity. Among his publications are Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors and Race Science in Fin de siècle Europe, Medicine and the German Jews, A History, German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic, The Jews, A Modern History, and All-Consuming Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat. Michael Brenner is Distinguished Professor of History and Seymour and Lillian Abson Chair in Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., where he serves as Director of the Center for Israel Studies. He also holds the Chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and is International President of the Leo Baeck Institute for the Study of German Jewish History and Culture, In 2014, he was awarded the Order of the Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. In 2021, he received the Baron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience. And in 2023, he received the Cultural Prize of Honor of the City of Munich. Among his 9 books are In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism, In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea, and the Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar, Germany. You can purchase All-Consuming at the link in the chat. Thank you again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to John and Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. And it is really an honor to be here and to be asked to introduce John Efron's new book, which, as many of his previous books, is a bit of a surprise. We would first say meat and German Jews. That is something that even many of us who've dealt with German Jews, European Jews, um, or the history of food have not heard much about. And John, maybe we'll start with you giving us a little outline of the book and telling us why Germans, German Jews, and why meat.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks to the museum for hosting this, and to Isabel Molina for doing the organizing of getting us together this evening. So thank you. You're right. We haven't heard much about this. Food history is a big area of study, and there's been lots of work that's been done, for example, on single foodstuffs, like histories of sugar, histories of salt, histories of bananas, histories of various other things. For the most part, that entire body of historiography hasn't made its way into Jewish history or the writing of Jewish history. There are some books, general books on Jewish foods, a couple of good histories, lots of Jewish cookbooks, needless to say, but nothing sort of like the singular focus that we see with in other areas of historical study, the singular focus on particular food. So it seemed to me that this was just a desideratum for the writing of modern Jewish history in general, to pay more attention to food. And in particular, meat is the subject that I've chosen, because meat is, beyond being a source of nourishment, of course, is rich in meanings and rich in symbols. And whether you eat meat, or whether one eats meat, or whether one doesn't eat meat, meat holds particularly sort of potent connotations, both positive and negative. It can engender delight. It can engender horror in some people, and feelings of dread. And meat may be an entire way of, I argue, of ordering the world. It represents a moral and ethical, religious, ritualistic, aesthetic, gustatory, of course, and linguistic set of networks and ideas and practices and attitudes when taken as a whole. So that's generally about meat. That could be said about any kind of meat and the cultures of meat for different peoples. But why write a book about the way Germans and Jews perceived each other's meat? And the reason is as follows. What I argue in the book is that from the Middle Ages almost until today, the meaning of meat in Germany as an object of both totem and taboo has played a crucial role in the ordering of social relations between Christians and Jews. And as well, and this is an important point, not just between Christians and Jews, but among Jews in Germany, which we'll talk about hopefully a little later. So Germany offers a particularly rich backdrop against which to view this contested culture of meat and its role in the formation of ethnic identities, both German identity and Jewish identity. And to an extent not seen anywhere else in Europe, in areas such as art, in text, law, scholarship, politics, commerce, popular culture, we see Germans have identified, thought about, studied, sometimes decried, and gladly eaten the meat of the Jews. Similarly, Jews in Germany thought about, studied, sometimes decried, and vigorously defended their meats and the culture and rituals surrounding them by educating Germans and Jews alike by focusing on the meaning and relevance. Now, central to the argument of the book is that meat is obviously more than just food. It is about identity. And this is especially the case for Jews and for Judaism, because meat is the focal point of the dietary laws and one of the most visible markers of Jewish distinctness and social separation. And in Germany, where meat is so central to the diet, for Germans too, meat was a matter of identity. So we can talk with that as sort of an introduction. We can go into further questions about the book, but I'll sort of stop it there and pursue a conversation.
Yes, thank you, John, for giving us an overview of the many aspects this book contains, and it really covers a huge span of time from the Middle Ages until post Second World War. And what I would like to start with is you started already with Jewish dietary laws, and also, and of course related to this, the shchita, the Jewish way of slaughtering, which had consequences and also led to all kinds of stereotypes in the non-Jewish world, maybe in Germany even a little different than elsewhere. Maybe we'll start with this, especially in the pre-modern period, but also how this was transported into the modern period.
Mm-hmm. So you're right. This is a book that covers about 700-800 years of history. And of all the writings about Jews and even their foods, their diet, their meat, up until the modern period, there was absolutely no accusations about no declarations about the nature of the Jewish animal slaughter in terms of it being cruel or in terms of it being improper. And of course, the Middle Ages is full of outlandish accusations against Jews, whether it's ritual murder charges, the blood libel, poisoning the wells of Europe, host desecration, all those kinds of things. And they're not just specifically German, of course, they're to be found all over Europe. There's nothing specifically German about them at all. The blood libel, as we know, began in England in 1144, so not even on the continent, as it were. The charge that Jews engaged in animal cruelty pertains specifically to shchita, kosher animal slaughter, and is an invention of the modern period, and really the 19th century, even late into the modern period. And it's then that we see, as part of sort of the larger anti-Semitic movement towards the end of the 19th century. This is one aspect of that movement. It ties into medieval charges of Jewish cruelty because, of course, things like ritual murder charges are based on an accusation that the Jews are a particularly cruel people. But the two most important rituals in Judaism, or two of the very most important rituals in Judaism, involve knives, and that's shchita and, of course, circumcision. So there was a view among those who were ill-disposed towards Jews, of course, that this was evidence that there was a particular bloodlust among Jews. But the cruelty to animals that was a charge of the modern period is, as I said, part of the larger anti-Semitic movement that began to sweep across Europe, but it particularly was highly organized in Germany in the last third of the 19th century. And it manifested itself in Germany in a concerted, I would say almost relentless, highly energetic and relentless effort to have kosher animal slaughter banned by law. And
let me go in here for a moment. Yeah. You show that with all the enmity that existed, there were also bonds, and sometimes even through meat and eating, and also defenders against those who wanted to outlaw the shchita.
That's right. So this is the thing about meat, is that I hadn't realized until I wrote the book. It came as somewhat of a surprise to me, but the laws of kashrut are in fact designed as a sort of form of social separation and distinctiveness, but kosher meat also brings people together in all sorts of ways. So already in the Middle Ages, and it's right through to today. So as most people watching this would know, you can't eat the hind part of say a cow or a sheep because of the sciatic nerve, because of an injunction against eating the sciatic nerve. Now, of course, when you kill a cow, slaughter a cow, you can't throw away a third of a cow. So that meat is sold, that portion of the carcass is sold to Christians, and always has been sold to non-Jews. So there is a case where in the medieval marketplace, for example, both Jewish butchers who were selling their meat and Christian customers stood to take advantage of the economics of the situation, because prices could be driven quite low by the buyers, and that was to the advantage of Christians, but also to the advantage of Jews, because, as I say, they don't have to throw out part of an animal. So meat, kosher meat, even because I would suggest, as I say in the book, because the laws of kashrut are designed to engender social distinction and separation, the injunction against certain portions of the animal being eaten by Jews led to cooperation. And you have a sort of an economic and eventually cultural codependency between Jewish butchers and Christian customers. Now, in the modern period, to get back to where we began this, the relentless campaign to eliminate kosher slaughter in Germany throughout the 19th century, interestingly, always failed, with the exception of the state of Saxony in 1892, where they were able to outlaw shchita, but it was rescinded in 1910 and permitted again. It consistently failed. And one of the reasons it failed is because the Jews had allies in parliament. And the strongest allies they had, and this came as a big surprise to me, was the Catholic Centre Party. The Catholic Centre Party and its great Titanic head, Ludwig Windthorst, was dedicated to the idea of freedom of religion, which was enshrined in every German state constitution and also at the national level as well. The Catholics came to, and the liberals as well. In some instances, of course, later on, in the 1930s, it was the Social Democrats who voted against shchita, seeking to outlaw it, particularly in the state of Bavaria. But we see one of the reasons that the campaign failed was because of strong allyship with non-Jewish politicians.
And before I ask
the
next question, I would like to encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A. We will take the last 15 minutes or so for your questions, but you can, of course, start writing them into the Q&A already. I'd like to shift a little bit from kashrut and shchita to cooking. And one section really, maybe my favorite chapter of the book, is about German Jewish cuisine, German Jewish cooking, cookbooks, mainly in the 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah.
And maybe you can give us a little bit of what you found there.
Sure. So the first thing to know about this is that Germany is really the first place where kosher cookbooks were published. They were almost exclusively written by women, and they are magnificent tomes. So the smallest one I found had about 250 recipes, and the largest one has 3,759. And those books are incredibly important. I mean, they're important because they're just in and of themselves interesting to look at. But one of the things that I did is that I went through these books very carefully and counted how many recipes had meat in them, because you can really tell a lot about sort of, the socioeconomic status of German Jewry, the importance played by meat in bourgeois culture and bourgeois culinary culture. And so in this book with 3,759 recipes, literally hundreds of recipes are either meat recipes or they are recipes that contain, a meat-based broth in their soups, in all sorts of ways. Even some of the desserts use, call for schmaltz or something like that, thereby rendering them fleischig, right? Meat dishes. So these books are incredibly interesting, but they also have a link to the Middle Ages. I wonder if can I read a recipe to you?
Yeah, I guess some people haven't had dinner yet, so they'll get their appetite, maybe.
Okay, so one of the things about these books is that 19th century recipes in these German Jewish cookbooks have echoes of medieval Western and Central European cooking techniques. And a typical technique of the Middle Ages, particularly from France, and it was food served at royal courts in the Middle Ages, involved a very elaborate process of deconstructing, stuffing, and reconstructing an animal, and then presenting it at table in the most elaborate and colorful display. So here's a recipe for turkey in aspic. The instructions tell the reader that after the turkey has been made kosher, it is to be spatchcocked, that is, cut from head to tail along its back. And when the entire carcass is exposed, the bird is to be deboned. Wings, legs, and all the flesh must remain in one piece. The boneless carcass is then stuffed with a force meat of minced veal, beef, heart, liver, shallots, onions, salt, pepper, nutmeg, eggs, pickled cucumbers, truffles, turnips, pistachios, and olives. The whole turkey is then to be sewn up, trussed, and bound between two boards, which are then lowered into a very large warm water bath to poach gently for 2 hours. The fire is then to be turned off and the turkey allowed to sit in the water until it has cooled. It is then to be removed and decorated with the aspic that formed during the cooking process. The aspic is dyed in various colors and cut into strips and placed all over the turkey to simulate its feathering. Spectacular and historically rich, turkey in aspic is to be served with, quote, either a fruit compote or a mustard sauce. So it's an incredibly elaborate dish. Obviously, it's sort of a once a year kind of thing. This is not daily fare, but it is interesting that there are echoes of medieval cooking techniques in the modern period, and the elaborateness of it is commensurate with, I think, sort of the elaborateness of the German Jewish table in sort of most bourgeois or upper bourgeois homes, where there may have been a cook to help the woman of the house, and various other staff as well. But the food that is related in some of this more elaborate food is really reflective of lives that were once lives that were no longer lived on the margins. I mean, I don't think people may not be aware just how economically marginal German Jewry was for a very long time, and then how, like Germany itself, was economically marginal for a very long time. And then towards the end of the 19th century, it became an economic powerhouse. And as the country goes, so too do its Jews. And so German Jewry and the socioeconomic background of German Jewry changed radically in a very, very short period of time from 1871, so where they were Pretty
John,
poor.
I think you should read the recipe very slowly again so everybody can take actually everybody can buy the book. So
Yeah,
it's in there.
it's in there, yes.
But it's not a cookbook, although there are some recipes in um, and actually our next time we'll be together with Joe Nathan, the
That's right.
cookbook author. But I would like to, it's a fascinating chapter, and I think the social history, not just of eating, but of cooking, tells you a lot about the everyday life of German Jews, as we don't, in a different way than we learn it from the sources we all know. But then the next chapter is about Nazi Germany
Yeah.
and what you call the pig conspiracy. And there's actually something like the pig massacre, which
Yeah.
I had never heard before,
Mhm.
never heard of before. And you found some interesting sources on the pig massacre. What was that?
Yeah. Okay. So in 1937, the Nazi Minister of Agriculture, Walter Darré, was Walter Darré. He wrote a book that year about something that had happened back in 1917 during World War I. Well, first of all, when he was a student, he wrote a thesis on the pig. I'm translating the title. It's a little bit awkward in English, but it's the pig as a criterion for Nordic peoples and Semites, by which he means Jews, of course. And of course, it talks about it's a sort of an agri-racialist view where he talks about a symbiosis between Nordic peoples and the aversion of Jews to pigs. Sort of the argument being, of course, that Aryan peoples, Nordic peoples, such as the Germans, have this affinity with pigs. And of course, the exact opposite is the case, and that's sort of with Jews. And so that translates into sort of the incompatibility of Germans and Jews, not just with what they eat, but anyway, that was his view. And he published that in 1927. In 1937, he writes a book called Der Schweinemord, which is sort of like the genocide of the pigs. And what happened is that Germany went into World War I, not having really made any plans. They thought the war would be over in a very short period of time, and there was no need for rationing or anything like that. And of course, there's a huge embargo. And it came to light that what it took to feed 10 million pigs could feed 64 million Germans. That was the calculus in terms of potatoes and various grain and that kind of thing.
And that was the German population.
Yeah, exactly. So the German government put together a commission called the Eltzbacher Commission, named after a man, a distinguished lawyer by the name of Paul Eltzbacher. And they recommended that somewhere between 10 and 15 million pigs should be culled so that food then could go to Germans. And it came to pass, and they killed a huge amount of pigs. Now, Walter Darré, who wrote the book about this episode in 1917, called The Genocide of the Pigs, noted that Paul Eltzbacher and other members of the Eltzbacher Commission were Jews. And so therefore, this wasn't just, this was part of a Jewish conspiracy, a concerted Jewish conspiracy to deny Germans their favorite meat. And at that time, already by the late 19th century, Germans ate about 115 pounds of meat per annum, per person. And 65% of the meat consumed in Germany was pork. And so you had this panel of so-called Jewish conspirators suggesting that and implementing a plan where millions of pigs would meet their end. And so Elsbacher said Daré said this was part of sort of the world Jewish conspiracy, but it was a plan that was designed to actually starve the Germans to death. And of course, it's an act of projection, of course, because it's precisely what the Nazis end up doing when the war was on, where starvation becomes an actual policy of Nazi Germany.
Yeah. I mean, fascinating. I really, I think historians have not really used this source. Let's stay for a moment in Nazi Germany. What happened to, and of course now kosher slaughter was outlawed immediately.
Yeah. So let me just say. So I
Yeah.
mentioned in the 19th century that one attempt after another failed to pass a national law. By 1925, when you had Nazis sitting in local parliaments, state parliaments, they started again to try and get legislation passed at the state level. And there was some success in that. There was some success, but the plan was always, and the goal was always, a national ban. The Nazis come to power, Hitler comes to power January the 30th, 1933. April the 21st, so it's about 11 weeks after he comes to power, in 1933, Shchita is banned. And you can tell just how important something is on the agenda of persecution by its date, and how little time passed between Hitler ascending to the chancellorship and then the passage of this law. So it's a measure of how important it was for the Nazis themselves. And so you would think that was the end of it. And in fact, it was just the beginning. How could it be the beginning? Because Shchita was tailor-made for Nazi propaganda. And they flooded the sort of iconographic zone, as it were, with lurid pictures of Shchita and animal suffering. And this stuff appeared in particularly Der Stürmer, right, the paper which had a weekly circulation of 476,000 copies. And there were always lurid pictures in there of Shchita, and lurid stories of Jewish cattle merchants and butchers committing acts of racial defilement. That was a focus of Streicher. And in addition to that, these pictures also appeared in children's books that he published with a very, very wide circulation, and in film. So there's a very infamous film called Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, that was made in 1940 by Goebbels. And the film goes for 1 hour, and there's a full 7-minute scene of Shchita staged for the cameras, and it was actually filmed in the Lodz ghetto. So it's a macabre and lurid and deeply unnerving and upsetting thing. But it just goes to show you that my point is that you would think that once the ban came in, there'd be nothing more to say. And that couldn't have been further from the truth. And the obsession with meat, which was one of long-standing, by the way. The Nazis said very little about Jews that hadn't been said before. The only thing that was novel about the Nazis is what they actually did to the Jews, but what they said about them was not. So there was already in the 19th century a strain, something that only appears in Germany. Really, it's a strain of right-wing biopolitics, and that is vegetarianism. Now we think of vegetarianism no longer. We don't have really political connotations with vegetarianism, but when it began, let's just say, to become somewhat more popular in the 1960s in the West, it was associated with sort of people of the left or hippies or whatever, and that's obviously no longer the case. But in Germany, already in the late 19th century, vegetarianism, there was a strain of vegetarianism. Not all vegetarians were like this, but there was a strain of vegetarianism that was deeply and implacably anti-Semitic, because they recognized the importance of meat for Jews, it being the center of the dietary laws. And they took it as a symbol and as a sign of Jewish decadence, particularly bourgeois decadence and bloodlust. And at the head of this were a number of people, most of whom are forgotten, but the most famous, of course, was Wagner, Richard Wagner. And around that circle of his in Bayreuth, there were lots of sort of anti-Semitic vegetarians. And remember, vegetarianism is about meat. It's not about vegetables. It's about avoiding meat. And so Wagner even held Jews responsible for introducing the consumption of meat into humanity, which is nonsense, of course, but facts never got in the way of an anti-Semitic accusation. And of course, Hitler attributed to Wagner his own decision to be a vegetarian. He said quite categorically.
Just want to ask you that. You have a nice pun or word play in there where you talk about vegetarians with an I, like Aryans, vegetarians, of these particular kind of people. What did the Orthodox Jews in Nazi Germany do after 1933?
So we've spoken about the Nazis, but how this impacted the Jews was enormous. As soon as the ban on the 21st of April came into effect, hundreds and hundreds of butchers, kosher butchers, were out of work and out of business. And there were desperate advertisements in the Jewish press, particularly in the Orthodox Jewish press, of people looking for work. But there was, of course, none. But they were very descriptive ads that said, "I'm a religious man. I've worked at a kosher butcher shop for 20 years. I have a family. I'm desperate for work. Do you think there's anywhere, any community that could take me," or anything like that? And other ads that appeared for Jews in Jewish newspapers, I should say, were where you could get kosher. You could still get imported kosher meat until 1938. So there would be ads that would say, at this particular hotel in Denmark, you could go to this hotel in Arnbra, which is sort of near the seaside hotel, and you could go there and you could get kosher meat. Or there were places that were advertised in the Jewish press telling you where to go on the Dutch-German border, just across the border into Holland, where you could go and buy different kinds of meat, poultry and red meat. And at this time, one of the things that's very important to realize, at this time, meat was considered by the medical establishment and entire scientific establishment as being the principal and almost irreplaceable source of protein in the human diet. And the Jewish communities were especially concerned about the elderly and those in Jewish nursing homes, those in Jewish old age homes, Jewish hospitals. And they were desperate they were desperate for kosher food. There were lots of people, particularly elderly people in these homes, who would only eat kosher. And there was a kind of new term that was invented called Neu Kosher, new kosher. And new kosher was a way of animals being killed by electronarcosis, meaning that they were electrocuted and almost simultaneously they were shechted, right? Almost simultaneously. And Jews were calling this new kosher, and thereby calling it new kosher, it seemed as if it was permissible. And the Orthodox establishment issued a blistering denunciation of this in 1934, saying basically, New kosher is nothing but old treif. There's absolutely no difference. And the fact that they had to repeat it again in 35 and 36 and 37 meant that people were eating this because they were so desperate for meat.
How easily accessible was imported kosher meat? Could they sell it?
It went through. There was an officially constituted body of the Nazi government. There was a Jewish body, but overseeing the Jewish body, there was a department of kosher meat in Nazi Germany, who was responsible for the allocation of this, and then it went out to the communities. But it became, like everything else, increasingly scarce, and by 1938, you couldn't even get imported meat anymore. But there was lots of illegal shchita that took place of poultry. Obviously, it's harder to kill a cow in secret, but there were instances of officials being bribed as late as 1937 who allowed shchita, and there was a case of one case of a Christian butcher who allowed his premises to be used by Jews to slaughter animals. He was caught and sent to a concentration camp. And so this is, I guess, in some respect, and I'm sure he didn't do it for free, but nonetheless, under the circumstances, it is a form of cooperation because it was extremely risky, as he found out.
So in that sense, it's a continuation of both strands from the centuries before.
Precisely.
Let me ask maybe the last question before we turn to the audience.
Yeah.
Your last chapter is about post-World War II, which is an area I'm also particularly interested in. I found it really fascinating what you found and we're talking about Jewish Holocaust survivors in post-war Germany, so-called displaced persons, DPs.
Yeah. So there were about much to the chagrin of the Germans, I think, there were about 250,000 Jews in DP camps. And most of them, the overwhelming majority, were Polish Jews, meaning that they come from traditional backgrounds. And they had their entire worlds taken from them. There was nothing left. They were sometimes alone, and they're the only people in their family to survive, or that they thought they were the only people to survive. They had no sense of the future. They had nowhere to go. And so for the American Joint Distribution Committee, who worked in tandem with the American Armed Forces, they were concerned, particularly the Joint Distribution Committee was concerned with trying to revive or create some kind of return to normalcy, whatever that meant under these circumstances. And so the Joint Distribution Committee, religion was the way to return to some sort of normalcy. So the Joint Distribution Committee doled out in the first year, I think, well over 1 million Shabbos candles to people in DP camps, for example, so they could light candles on Friday night. The other thing that was necessary for this was meat, kosher meat. These are people who hadn't eaten much in a very long time, and they certainly hadn't had access to kosher meat. A lot of these were not survivors of camps, but they were people who fled east with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. So they fled deep into the Soviet territory. Well, being a Marxist godless state, kosher meat was pretty hard to come by in the Soviet Union. So they hadn't had it there either. And so the aid agencies, the Jewish aid agencies, and together with the American Armed Forces, worked very hard to bring kosher meat back to these Jews. And so that's another story that just doesn't happen anywhere else. This is a uniquely German story because just by virtue of the fact that the DP camps, there are some in Austria and a couple in Italy, but they're overwhelmingly, as you know, in Germany. that after everything that had happened, not only do you have 250,000 Jews, but you have the return of kosher meat to Germany is the way that that story concludes. And I would just add that the very forces that worked so hard to get rid of kosher meat from the late 19th century, which was an unholy alliance of anti-Semitic politicians and animal protection societies who worked together, are the same sorts of forces, animal protection societies together with right-wing politicians today who are focusing now on halal slaughter. But you see a sort of a revivification of an old story, very similar in its...
There is a whole, of course, contemporary story in Europe about efforts to outlaw kosher slaughtering. Let me just go to the questions, and I don't think I can read all of them. They're different kinds, and I'm taking 2 or 3 together because they are all about this group of questions about writing this book. One question is, can you talk a bit more about your research process for the book and what primary and secondary sources you used? And I'll take this together with the question, what inspired you to write this book? And the question, how was the process of writing this book similar to or different from writing your other books? So the sources, inspiration, and how is it different?
Sources, inspiration. So the sources, well, I've mentioned one source, and that was the cookbooks. So there are published sources. There were sources to do with sort of trade magazines, farming manuals, publications for farmers. In that chapter on outlawing shchita, I also read through the manufacturers' brochures of those who made slaughterhouse equipment. And if you look at some of the slaughterhouse equipment, you'll see that the charges of Jewish cruelty to animals was really an act of projection, I think, more than anything else, because the methods of slaughter in European slaughterhouses were absolutely brutal. So trade magazines, journals, and of course, some of the medieval stuff, medieval shchita manuals that were published in Germany in the 15th century. So those are some of the sources that I use. And the last chapter, of course, was the American Joint Distribution archives that are a Center for Jewish History. One can read them there. U.S. Army archives as well that talks about their efforts. So there's that. Those are some of the sources. Then the inspiration for the book. The book started out actually as something else. I was writing I thought I would write a history of German Jewry through the prism of the 5 human senses. And it was, and I still think a very nice idea, but it's not doable. Because some of the senses were possible. If you get to sight, what are you going to write about? What Jews saw, how Jews were seen. Whatever you do, there would be critics saying, "Oh, you should have done it this way, you should have done it that way," and I would have agreed with them. I mean, so there was no. It was too ambitious, but also not a really what historians call doable project. But I did start to write it, and I was interested in the sense of smell. And smell, I had a handle on those sources, particularly the medieval ones. And I was particularly interested in something that is unique to Germany, and that's a particular statue that first appears in the Middle Ages in the 13th century. And then it's called the Judensau, which is sort of translates as the Jewish sow. And it's these depictions of Jews with pigs. usually suckling the teats of pigs. But with the advent of print, those things went viral. So from what were sculptures and carvings in churches ends up being sort of published and printed, and you have a lot more scope, and they become the most, what I think are the most extreme images in the entire history of anti-Semitic iconography, which is really saying something. But they are that. So I started to do that. But when I saw these images of Jews and pigs, and of course they were not eating the flesh of pigs. They were never shown eating the flesh of pigs. They were shown eating the waste of pigs, so as to indicate their inhumanity. That led in my mind from one thing to another. And I said, well, they're not eating the pigs, but why not write a book about meat and German Jewry and their relationship to the larger environment? And lo and behold, I just found just a mountain of sources from all different kinds of sources, including literary ones as well. Heine and other satirists of the 19th century. Heine was a great devotee of Ashkenazic food, the poet Heine, and wrote lovingly about Ashkenazi cooking and meat, and as did others. So I did that. And then the final question there was about how this differed from the other books I've written. Well, I've liked writing all the other books I've written, but I've enjoyed writing this one the most. This was deeply personal to me. I come from a background where the family in Poland, my mother is from Poland, she's 92. They had a bakery in Poland, and so baking was my mother's main sort of cooking métier. But in addition to sort of the traditional Jewish foods that came with her, she became really a master of haute pâtisserie. And so I grew up with that and her cooking. And then they also, having come to Australia, they came to also, they left behind what were largely healthy vegetarian diets in Central Europe, in Poland, to a prodigious meat-eating country like Australia. And so meat was extremely important in the diet and the home that I grew up in, and cooked to and sort of the focus on exquisite food was something that was deeply personal to me. And so the beginning of the book is somewhat autobiographical before I get into the main meat of the book, as it were. It's autobiographical because having grown up in a home where food was everything, was not just a source of sustenance, but it was my mother's form of art.
And I may say, Professor Efron is very modest here. Whoever has seen or eaten from his mother's table in Melbourne, I think knows exactly what it's very rare to see kosher and Jewish food of this quality and this amazing, I would say, visual quality too. And she's still going high,
Still
cooking in her
going.
90s.
There are 3
And I should
freezers.
say that her son inherited some of these cooking abilities.
Yeah, well, a
But
pale
let's not go into
imitation, but
before everybody comes to Berkeley and knocks at your door.
right.
Let me read a few more questions.
Yeah.
Um, there was a question about the German Jew. Yes, earlier in the call, you discussed how most of the German Jewish cuisine cookbooks were mainly written by women.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the extent to which women were involved in establishing and maintaining Jewish traditions relating to food and cooking?
So women were, I think, were essential to the maintenance of traditions in Germany. The women who wrote these books tended to be also professional cooks in Jewish homes. They won awards for these books, but generally speaking, the home is where Jewish culture and Jewish tradition is transmitted. And so it struck me, again, from personal experience, but also just, as a historian of the Jewish people, um, it struck me that there needed to be in this book a focus on the home as a place where a culinary culture is part of sort of a chain of transmission, kind of like a shalshelet Kabbalah, as they say, where this transmission from one generation to the next. And women, I think, were largely responsible for this because there was performative aspect to the Jewish home, of course, Shabbat or something like that, and that would be the man's domain to say Kiddush and Moitzi and things like that. But who did the cooking? Who did the actual the really hard work of making sure that a Sabbath table or a Yontif table was as it should be, right, according to that culture. And that fell to women. And there hasn't been, other than been some historians, Marian Kaplan, most noticeably, of course. Marian has really established the importance of women in German Jewish culture, and particularly bourgeois domesticity, like the culture of the home, was really the preserve of women. So they're incredibly important.
So I'm afraid there's maybe room for one more question because we have 1 hour. And that's actually quite interesting question about the recipe you gave for turkey in Aspic. And the question is, I was under the impression that turkey was not indigenous to Europe. Does that mean that these recipes were also influenced by American cuisine?
Looking at those cookbooks, there's next to nothing that's American in them or about them. They are very, very Central European. One of the things that in that chapter, I should say, I mean, the fact that there were turkeys in Europe by that particular time, that's all. But I wouldn't attribute it to an American influence in any way. The cuisine that's closest to this particular kind of food was the cooking of Polish Jews. There's a real similarity. There are some differences, but generally speaking, what was served on a table in Berlin, you would find in a table in Brody, something like that. In Würzburg, you'd say in Warsaw as well, something very, very similar. It would have different names. So, the German I have this section in this book where in that chapter where if you look at the German names for some of these dishes, so the turkey dish is called Truthahn à la Gelatine, right? In aspic, right? So they use a French word for it, or kidneys in Madeira sauce or something like that. So those are not names of foods that you would have seen in Eastern Europe among the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Poland, but they were very, very similar dishes. So as much difference as there was between German Jewry and Polish Jewry, and much exaggerated difference between them, there's real differences, and some of there are also exaggerated differences. They share generally, and these are two countries that border each other, and they have very similar climates, so they have similar growing seasons, and the crops are very similar. And so the foods, of course, you get a much more Western European influence in Germany by virtue of the fact that you border in the western part, you border France, right? So, but generally speaking, if there is a sort of a mutual influence between the two, between Germany and any other Jewish cuisine from somewhere else or that of another country, it would be next door to the east in Poland.
Thank you so much, John. I think our time is up, and there are a few more questions which I think I cannot answer, but I cannot read. You cannot answer because there's no time left. I hope some of you still have the dinner before them and have strengthened their appetite. It is a really innovative, deeply researched, and extremely well-written book. And I just recommend everybody to get the book and read the rest, and then you get the answers to your questions as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone for joining this. And Michael, thank you very much once again for a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Isabel as well.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all. And just a reminder, you can purchase All Consuming at the link in the chat, which I've just put in there again for all of you. And two quick museum reminders. We hope that if you enjoyed today's program, you'll consider making a donation to the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope to see all of you at our upcoming programs, which you can learn more about at mjhnyc.org/current events. Again, both of those links are in the chat, along with the link to purchase the book. Lastly, you can view past programs and view and share the recording of today's program, which will be on our YouTube channel by early next week. And with that, thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope you have a great night and that we'll see you soon. Thank you. And thank you, Michael and John.
Thank you.